In 1998, she outsold Stone Cold Steve Austin and single-handedly revived Playboy. Yet today, she is a ghost. Meet Sable, the woman WWE desperately wants to forget. It is an insane paradox. The only person audacious enough to slap Vince McMahon with a $110 million harassment lawsuit is now the wife of the Beast, Brock Lesnar, the company's golden goose. She went from being the planet's ultimate sex symbol to a traceless hermit in the frozen Canadian wilderness. Why has such a monumental icon been completely scrubbed from history? This silence isn't failure. It is the ultimate power move from the only woman who dared to flip the table on the empire and actually won. Rena Marlette Greek was born on August the 8th, 1967 in Jacksonville, Florida. Jacksonville in the late 1960s was not a place of leisure. It was a sprawling industrial city defined by its massive naval presence and working-class ethos. Rena was not born into the entertainment industry. There were no parents pushing her toward casting calls, no stage mothers managing her schedule. She was a product of the classic American middle class. Her father and mother provided a stable, albeit strict, environment. The Greek household was one of discipline. From the moment she could walk, Rena possessed an excess of kinetic energy. She was not a child who sat still. In the humid heat of northern Florida, she found her outlet in physical exertion. While her later career would be defined by her appearance, her formative years were defined by her athleticism. She threw herself into sports with a singular focus. She played softball, she rode horses, and she ran. But the true architect of her character was gymnastics. Gymnastics is a brutal sport. It requires a level of physical compliance and pain tolerance that borders on masochism. Rena began training at a young age, spending hours in chalk-dusted gymnasiums, drilling the same routines until her hands blistered and tore. This period of her life is critical. Gymnastics taught her two things that would make her millions of dollars 2 decades later. First, it taught her proprioception, the awareness of her body in space. When you watch Sable in the wrestling ring years later, even though she was untrained in combat, she never looked clumsy. She knew how to arch her back, how to extend her limbs, how to fall without breaking a wrist. That grace was purchased in the sweaty gyms of Jacksonville in the 1970s. Second, and perhaps more importantly, gymnastics taught her the performance of stoicism. In gymnastics, if you crash on the balance beam and bruise your ribs, you do not cry. You stand up, you salute the judges, and you smile. You present a facade of perfection even when your body is screaming. This was the rehearsal for her life as Sable. She learned that the audience doesn't care about your pain, they care about your presentation. Throughout her teenage years, Rena was a tomboy in disguise. She rode horses with a fearlessness that unnerved her parents. She developed a physical confidence that most young girls in that era were discouraged from having. She wasn't trying to be pretty, she was trying to be capable. However, as she entered high school at Inglewood High, biology began to dictate her path. She stood 5 feet 8 inches tall. She had a bone structure that caught the light. The tomboy was disappearing, replaced by a striking young woman who stopped traffic. In 1985, Rena graduated high school. She did not follow the path to university. The academic life didn't appeal to her restless nature. Instead, she looked at the assets she had available, her height, her face, and her discipline. She entered the world of modeling. The modeling industry in Florida in the late 1980s was a grind. It wasn't the high-fashion runways of Paris, it was catalog work, commercial shoots, and endless auditions. Rena approached it like a job, not a lifestyle. She was pragmatic. She quickly found success. Her look, blonde, athletic, undeniably American, was in high demand. She booked campaigns for major national brands. She appeared in advertisements for L'Oreal, selling hair products with her signature mane. She shot for Pepsi, appearing in promotional materials that required that specific girl next door energy. She modeled for Guess, a brand famous for launching sex symbols. This period was her business school. Modeling strips away a person's vanity and replaces it with a cold awareness of market value. Rena learned that she was a product. She learned that photographers and directors didn't care about her personality. They cared about the angle of her chin and the light in her eyes. She learned to turn it on and off. The Sable stare, that cold, detached look that would later terrify wrestling fans, was perfected in front of Nikon lenses in Miami studios. She learned that silence could be more powerful than speaking. If you just stood there and looked perfect, people would project their own fantasies onto you. But the modeling world was lonely. It was a transient life of hotel rooms and waiting areas. Rena, despite her growing portfolio, desired something more grounded. She wanted a home. In 1986, the trajectory of her life shifted. She met a man named Wayne Richardson. Wayne was not a celebrity. He was not a photographer or a producer. He was a regular guy from Florida. He offered Rena something the industry never could: stability. He didn't look at her as a mannequin. He looked at her as a partner. The romance was swift and intense. Rena fell in love hard. For a woman who had spent years being judged on her exterior, Wayne's affection for her interior life was intoxicating. They married in 1987. Rena was only 20 years old. By modern standards, this is incredibly young. But Rena was an old soul. She was ready to leave the chaotic go-sees of the modeling world behind for domestic life. Shortly after the marriage, Rena became pregnant. In 1988, she gave birth to a daughter, Mariah. This transformation from model to mother was absolute. Rena embraced it. She pulled back from the aggressive schedule of modeling. She focused on raising Mariah. Friends from that era described Rena as a fiercely protective mother. The discipline she once applied to the balance beam was now applied to parenting. She wanted everything to be perfect for her family. For 3 years, life was idyllic. They were a young, beautiful family living the Florida dream. Rena had escaped the trap of the starving artist. She had won the game. She had love, she had a child, and she had a husband who adored her. October 19th, 1991. The details of the night are stark. Wayne Richardson had gone out with friends. Rena was at home with 3-year-old Mariah. There was a car accident. Alcohol was involved. The driver lost control. The knock on the door, or perhaps the phone call, the specific delivery method of the news is a detail Rena has kept private, shattered the world. Wayne Richardson was dead. At the age of 24, Rena Greek was a widow. The psychological impact of this event cannot be overstated. It is the defining trauma of her life. In one violent instant, the security she had built was vaporized. The grief was compounded by terror. She was a single mother in her early 20s. She had no college degree. Her husband was gone. The primary income was gone. This moment forged the Sable armor. When you lose the most important person in your world, you develop a hardness. You realize that the universe is not fair. You realize that you cannot rely on anyone else to save you. Rena went into survival mode. There was no time to wallow. She had a daughter to feed. The soft Rena, the girl who trusted the world, was buried with Wayne. In her place rose a woman who was calculated, guarded, and fiercely driven by financial anxiety. She returned to the only work she knew, modeling. But the joy was gone. It was now purely a transaction. She needed money. She hustled. She took every booking she could get. She dragged herself to auditions, smiling for the camera while her internal world was gray and ash. 1993, 2 years after Wayne's death. Rena was 26. She was working, raising Mariah and keeping to herself. She had no interest in dating. She certainly had no interest in the bizarre subculture of professional wrestling. Then she met Mark Mero. Mero was a former amateur boxer from New York who had transitioned into professional wrestling. At the time, he was working for World Championship Wrestling as a character named Johnny B. Bad. He was everything Wayne was not. He was loud, he was flamboyant, he drove flashy cars, he was a creature of the spotlight. They met at a gym, the natural habitat for both of them. Mero was struck immediately by her beauty. He later recalled that she was the most stunning woman he had ever seen. But Rena was hesitant. Mero was a wrestler. He was on the road constantly. He lived a life of excess. However, Mero was persistent, and he was kind. He saw the sadness in her. He saw the protective wall she had built around herself and her daughter. He didn't try to break it down. He tried to stand in front of it. He offered her a different kind of security. Not the quiet suburban security of Wayne, but a financial and physical security. He was a star. He was making good money. He promised to take care of her and Mariah. For a young widow terrified of the future, Mero was a lifeline. They began dating. It was a whirlwind. Mero introduced her to a world she didn't understand. He took her to wrestling shows. She saw the carnival, the screaming fans, the blood, the steroids, the politics. She hated it. She thought it was barbaric and fake. She wanted nothing to do with the industry. But she loved Mark, and Mark loved her. In 1994, they married. Rena took his last name. She was now Rena Mero. She thought the deal was simple. Mark would go on the road and wrestle, making the money. She would stay home in Florida, raise Mariah, and perhaps dabble in acting or modeling on the side. She wanted to be a wife, not a performer. She auditioned for small roles in movies and TV shows. She nearly landed a spot on a soap opera. She was trying to carve out an identity that didn't involve spandex or steel chairs. But destiny has a sense of irony. In 1996, Mark Mero's contract with WCW expired. He was looking for a change. He entered negotiations with the World Wrestling Federation. The WWF was run by Vince McMahon, a ruthlessly brilliant promoter who was looking for new talent to refresh his roster. McMahon was interested in Mero. He saw potential in his athleticism and his boxing background. During one of the negotiation meetings, or perhaps in a casual conversation as the deal was being finalized, Mark Mero mentioned his wife. The story goes that Mero showed McMahon a photo of Rena. Vince McMahon stopped. He looked at the photo. He looked at Mero. And in that split second, the gears of history shifted. McMahon didn't care about Mark Mero's boxing gloves. He didn't care about his work rate. He pointed at the photo of Rena and said effectively, "I want her." Mero was hesitant. Rena had no training. She wasn't a wrestler. She was a mom. She was a model. She didn't know how to take a bump. She didn't know the psychology of the ring. McMahon didn't care. He knew what star power looked like. He saw a woman who could cross over. He saw a woman who could appeal to the teenage demographic he was desperate to capture. He made an offer. Mark Mero would come in as the wild man, and Rena would come in as his valet. She wouldn't have to wrestle. She just had to walk him to the ring. She just had to look good. Mero took the deal back to Rena. Rena was reluctant. She didn't want to be a valet. It sounded demeaning. It sounded cheap, but the money was good, and it meant she could travel with Mark instead of sitting at home worrying about him. It meant keeping the family together. She agreed. A short-term gig, a few appearances, just to help Mark get over. She packed her bags. She left Mariah with family. She flew to the arena. She had no idea that she was walking into a hurricane. She had no idea that the moment she stepped through the curtain, the Rena she knew would die, and Sable would be born. The tragedy of her first husband had hardened her. The discipline of gymnastics had prepared her body. The modeling industry had taught her how to pose. Everything was leading to this. The stage was set for Wrestlemania 12. The lights inside the Arrowhead Pond of Anaheim on March 31st, 1996, did not just illuminate a wrestling ring. They illuminated a threshold. It was Wrestlemania 12, the grandest stage of the industry, a spectacle of noise and color designed to overwhelm the senses. For Rena Mero, standing behind the heavy velvet curtain of the entrance ramp, the noise must have sounded like a physical wave, a roar of 20,000 people baying for violence and entertainment. She was 28 years old, a mother, a widow, and until this very moment, a complete civilian. She was about to step into a world that operated on a logic entirely alien to the one she knew in Jacksonville. There was no script for what she was feeling, only the hurried instructions of producers telling her where to walk and when to look at the camera. She was cast in the role of a silent accessory, a valet for the aristocrat villain Hunter Hearst Helmsley, a man who would later rule the business, but was then just another climbing star. The plan was simple. She would escort him to the ring, look beautiful, and then inevitably be rescued by her real-life husband, wild man Mark Mero, cementing his status as the new hero of the World Wrestling Federation. It was Wrestling Booking 101, a simple damsel in distress narrative. But as the music hit and she stepped through the curtain, something shifted in the atmosphere of the arena, a chemical reaction that no writer had penned. When the audience saw her, the dynamic of the segment fractured. Hunter Hearst Helmsley was the focus, the wrestler, the talent, but the eyes of the arena were magnetized to the woman walking a step behind him. She wore a simple, elegant gown, her blonde hair cascading in the calculated disarray of a romance novel cover, but it was her expression that arrested the crowd. She did not smile with the desperate, pleading energy of the other valets of the era who danced and waved for approval. She stared out at the sea of faces with a cool, impenetrable detachment. It was the Sable stare, the first iteration of the character that would define her. In the ring, when Mark Mero made the save, attacking Helmsley and claiming Rena as his own, the crowd cheered, but the frequency of the noise had changed. They weren't cheering for the wild man because of his boxing skills or his energy. They were cheering for him because he had won the prize. He had the girl. In that opening night, the seed of their eventual destruction was planted. The audience had already decided that she was the star and he was the accessory, an inversion of power that the insecure ecosystem of professional wrestling is ill-equipped to handle. The weeks and months following WrestleMania 12 were a baptism by fire. Rena was thrust into a life of perpetual motion, a traveling circus that moved from city to city, night after night. The logistics of the wrestling business in 1996 were grueling. This was not the corporate, sanitized WWE of the modern era, with luxury buses and wellness policies. This was the gritty tail end of the new generation era, a time of rental cars, cheap motels, and 300 days a year on the road. For a woman who had spent the last few years seeking stability for her daughter, the chaos was jarring. She traveled with Mark, which offered a layer of protection, but it also isolated her. The wrestling locker room is a notoriously insular tribe, suspicious of outsiders, and Rena was the ultimate outsider. She hadn't paid her dues in high school gyms. She hadn't slept in her car to make a booking. She had walked in the front door because of how she looked. The resentment from the boys was palpable, a low hum of hostility that followed her from the catering area to the gorilla position. She was viewed as a tourist in their church, a model playing dress-up. To cope, Rena retreated inward. She became known backstage as aloof, even arrogant. She didn't socialize. She didn't drink at the hotel bars with the rest of the crew. She finished her segment, showered, and left with Mark. This behavior, born of a defense mechanism and a desire to get back to her daughter, was misinterpreted as elitism. It fed the narrative that she thought she was better than the business. But on television, that same aloofness was becoming her greatest asset. While other female personalities like Sunny were loud, brash, and overexposed, Sable was a mystery. She barely spoke. She stood at ringside while Mark Marrow wrestled, her face an impassive mask, occasionally breaking into a rare, radiant smile that felt earned rather than given. The fans began to project their own narratives onto her silence. She was the untouchable goddess, the refined beauty in a world of beasts. The merchandise numbers began to trickle in, and then they began to pour. T-shirts with her face, posters, foam fingers. The machinery of capitalism was recognizing what the locker room refused to admit. She was money. Then the physical reality of the sport intervened. In 1997, Mark Marrow suffered a torn ACL, a devastating knee injury that would keep him out of action for 6 months. In the Darwinian world of wrestling, an injury is usually a death sentence for a character's momentum. If you aren't on TV, you don't exist. But Vince McMahon, seeing the rising tide of Sable's popularity, made a decision that broke with tradition. He kept Sable on television without him. This was the pivotal moment, the decoupling of the satellite from the planet. Without Mark Marrow to stand behind, Sable had to become a character in her own right. She began to appear in segments promoting the Sable brand, unleashing a charisma that had been stifled by her role as a silent valet. She wasn't just holding a coat anymore, she was the attraction. When Mark Marrow finally returned from rehabilitation, he walked into a different reality. He was no longer the wild man bringing his wife to work. He was now Mr. Sable. The writers, sensing the real-life tension and the undeniable crowd reaction, decided to turn the subtext into text. They scripted a storyline that mirrored the uncomfortable truth of their marriage. Mark Marrow would become jealous of Sable's fame. He would become a controlling, insecure husband, demanding she cover up her body, demanding she stand in the back, demanding she stop stealing his spotlight. It was a shoot turned into a work, a dangerous game where the performers are asked to reenact their own marital strife for an audience of millions. For Mark, it was a professional humiliation to play a character who was lesser than his wife. But he did it with the professionalism of a veteran, leaning into the villainy. For Rena, it was a liberation. On screen, as Mark tried to force her into robes and potato sacks to hide her beauty, the crowd's sympathy for her exploded. She became the ultimate babyface, the symbol of a woman breaking free from patriarchal control. Every time she defied him, every time she unzipped the robe to reveal the superstar underneath, the arenas would shake with a primal approval. This storyline required Rena to evolve physically. She could no longer just be a mannequin. She had to get involved. The violence of the ring began to encroach on her. She took her first bumps, the jarring impacts of hitting the canvas. She learned to run the ropes, though her form was raw. She wasn't a wrestler, and she didn't pretend to be one, but she possessed a frantic, scrappy energy that worked. When she slapped a villain or shoved a rival, it didn't look like a choreographed dance. It looked like a real fight. The fans loved the imperfection. It made her feel authentic. This was 1998, and the polished, cartoonish style of the 80s was dead. The audience wanted grit. They wanted to see the beauty queen get her hands dirty. Her primary antagonist became Luna Vashon, a woman who was the aesthetic and spiritual opposite of Sable. Luna was terrifying, with veins painted on her shaved head, a gravelly voice, and a legitimate wrestling pedigree. Luna was a general in the ring, a master of her craft who understood that her job was to make Sable look like $1 million. The feud with Luna Vashon was the crucible that forged Sable, the superstar. Luna, selfless and professional, guided Rena through the physical language of the match. She took the hits, she sold the fear, and she allowed the untrained model to toss her around the ring. In return, Rena committed fully. She didn't shy away from the contact. There's a specific moment in the lead-up to WrestleMania 14 that defines this era. Sable, pushed to the brink by Luna, and the torment of her now estranged on-screen husband Mark, finally snapped. She attacked. The brawl was messy, hair-pulling, screaming chaos, but the intensity was electric. The crowd wasn't watching a match. They were watching a fight. This culminated at WrestleMania 14 in Boston in a mixed tag team match, Sable and Goldust versus Mark Marrow and Luna Vashon. It was one of the most anticipated matches on a card that featured Stone Cold Steve Austin and Mike Tyson. The pressure on Rena was immense. This wasn't walking to the ring, this was performing in it live, with no safety net. When Sable tagged into the match at WrestleMania 14, the reaction was deafening. She moved with a surprising speed, hitting moves she had drilled obsessively, a kick, a takedown, and finally, the TKO, her husband's own finishing maneuver. When she pinned Luna Vashon for the 3 count, the pop from the Fleet Center crowd rivals any reaction in the history of the business. It was a release of 2 years of storytelling tension. The valet was dead. The competitor was born. In that moment, holding her arm in the air, Rena Marrow had successfully crossed the impossible chasm from eye candy to main event player. She had proven that she could deliver when the bell rang, but the victory was Pyrrhic. The more famous she became, the more the real Mark Marrow faded into the background, and the more the fragile ecosystem of their marriage deteriorated. The line between the character who didn't need a man and the woman who went home to one was blurring beyond recognition. As 1998 progressed, the WWF entered the stratosphere of pop culture domination, and Sable was strapped to the nose cone of the rocket. With the jealous husband storyline concluded, she was unleashed as a solo act. The shackles were off. The company began to market her aggressively, leaning into the sexual revolution of the late 90s. The Sable character became bolder, her outfits more provocative, her microphone work more confident. She was given a voice. In interviews, she dropped the mysterious persona and began to speak with a brash American confidence. She coined catchphrases. She engaged in bikini contests that, while controversial by modern standards, were ratings juggernauts at the time. She was becoming the female equivalent of Stone Cold Steve Austin, a rebellious, unstoppable force who did what she wanted, wore what she wanted, and answered to no one. However, fame of this magnitude acts as an accelerant for isolation. The higher Sable climbed, the fewer allies she had. The women's locker room, previously a place of indifference, turned into a snake pit of jealousy. Other female performers who were trained wrestlers working for a fraction of the pay and none of the glory watched with bitterness as the model took the top spots. They saw her success as an insult to their craft. Rena, sensing this hostility, withdrew further. She demanded her own dressing room. She traveled with security. She stopped riding with the talent. To the roster, she was a diva in the pejorative sense. To Rena, she was a woman under siege, protecting herself and her brand from a hostile environment. She was living in a bubble of adoration from the fans and icy silence from her peers. The culmination of this ascent was the resurrection of the WWF Women's Championship. The title had been deactivated, considered irrelevant by the company for years, but Sable was too big not to have a crown. In November 1998 at Survivor Series, the title was brought back specifically for her. When she defeated Jacqueline to win the championship, it wasn't a technical masterclass, but it was a coronation. She stood in the center of the ring, the golden belt around her waist, tears streaming down her face. Those tears were real. They were the release of a woman who had survived the death of a husband, the poverty of single motherhood, the judgment of a male-dominated industry, and the collapse of her second marriage, all to stand on top of the mountain. She had conquered the world that had tried to reject her. But the mountain top is a dangerous place to live. The oxygen is thin, the air is cold, and as 1998 turned into 1999, the very machine that had built Sable began to hunger for more than she was willing to give. The demands became more extreme. The sexualization became more aggressive. The Attitude Era was pushing boundaries, and Sable was the battering ram they used to break them. She was about to find out that being the queen comes with a heavy tax, and the collection day was approaching fast. The girl from Jacksonville, who just wanted security, had found fame instead, and she was beginning to realize that they are not the same thing. The cracks in the armor were starting to show, not on camera, but in the quiet moments in rental cars and lonely hotel rooms, where the roar of the crowd couldn't drown out the growing sense of unease. By the spring of 1999, Rena Mero was standing at the absolute zenith of pop culture. The WWF was obliterating its competition, and Sable was its most valuable commercial asset. In April, she appeared on the cover of Playboy, an issue that became one of the fastest-selling in the magazine's history. It was the ultimate crossover victory, proving she was a mainstream icon, not just a wrestling character. But inside the insular world of the WWF, this success painted a target on her back. The locker room, filled with wrestlers who broke their bodies for a fraction of her pay, turned on her. The resentment was palpable. Rena was viewed as an outsider, a prima donna who didn't respect the business. Isolated and defensive, she retreated into herself, demanding private security, which only fueled the rumors of her arrogance. The WWF creative team, sensing the real-life animosity, decided to blur the lines. They turned Sable into a villain on screen. She became Hollywood Sable, an arrogant, delusional diva who despised the fans. The storylines shifted from empowering to degrading. She was booked in endless bikini contests and evening gown matches. Her championship treated as a prop to be thrown in the trash. The nuance was gone. She was being objectified and humiliated on national television every week. Behind the scenes, the pressure reached a boiling point. The demands became increasingly uncomfortable. Rena allegedly refused to participate in storylines that she felt compromised her safety and dignity, only to be met with threats to her career. She realized the machine that built her was now trying to break her. In June 1999, she made the unthinkable decision to pull the plug. She abruptly left the company and filed a lawsuit that shook the industry to its core. The figure was staggering. $110 million. But it was the language of the lawsuit that terrified the WWF. Rena wasn't just suing for money, she was suing for sexual harassment and an unsafe working environment. She alleged a culture of coercion where women were treated as cattle. In 1999, decades before the Me Too movement, these allegations were a nuclear threat to a company preparing to go public on the stock market. The WWF fought back in the press, painting her as an ungrateful traitor. But behind closed doors, they knew they couldn't afford a public trial that would expose the dark underbelly of the Attitude Era. In August 1999, a settlement was reached. The terms were sealed in a strict non-disclosure agreement. The lawsuit was dropped. Rena Mero walked away with her silence and a fortune, but she was effectively exiled from the only industry she knew. She had escaped the gilded cage, but she was now a queen without a kingdom. The silence that followed the 1999 settlement was deafening. At 32, Rena Mero was wealthy, but she was professionally homeless. The industry she had dominated had branded her a pariah, and the adrenaline of live performance was replaced by a terrifying void. She attempted to pivot to mainstream Hollywood, hoping her Playboy fame would translate into an acting career. It was a humbling failure. Casting directors in Los Angeles saw only a wrestling diva, not an actress. She landed minor decorative roles in shows like Pacific Blue and the film Corky Romano, but the doors to legitimate stardom remained locked. She realized a harsh truth. Outside the wrestling bubble, her power evaporated. Amidst this professional stagnation, her personal life collapsed. Her marriage to Mark Mero, already strained by jealousy and the bizarre dynamics of their on-screen storylines, finally disintegrated. They were two people living in a museum of past glories, and without the shared chaos of the road, there was nothing left to hold them together. By 2003, with her options narrowing, Rena did the unthinkable. She picked up the phone and called Vince McMahon. In the wrestling business, money always trumps morality. Despite the $110 million lawsuit and the burned bridges, a deal was struck. In April 2003, Sable returned to the WWE. But the woman who walked back through the curtain was different. She was hardened, sporting a sharper look and a colder demeanor. She returned not as the beloved heroine, but as a villainous cougar, thrust immediately into a tawdry storyline as Vince McMahon's on-screen mistress. However, the locker room she returned to had evolved. A new generation of athletic women, like Trish Stratus and Lita, now ruled the roost. Sable was the old guard, fighting for relevance in a company that viewed her as a nostalgia act. But amidst the trashy storylines and backstage politics, destiny intervened. Rena crossed paths with the company's newest, most terrifying monster, a 25-year-old prodigy named Brock Lesnar. He was the next big thing, but he hated the spotlight as much as she once craved it. In him, she found a kindred spirit, someone who saw through the facade of the industry. What started as a backstage romance quickly became a lifeline. As 2004 approached, they both realized they were trapped in a machine they hated, and they began to plot their escape together. By the spring of 2004, the World Wrestling Federation, now firmly the WWE, was a company in transition. The anarchy of the Attitude Era had been sterilized, replaced by a more corporate, publicly traded product. For Rena Mero, performing as Sable, this new environment was suffocating. She was 36 years old. In an industry obsessed with youth, where the next crop of 20-year-old models was constantly being bussed in from developmental territories, Rena was now the veteran. This is a dangerous designation in wrestling. It demands that you use your star power to elevate the younger talent, to lose matches, and to pass the torch. Rena, however, was not built to be a stepping stone. Her character was predicated on being the alpha, the untouchable, the center of the universe. The creative team struggled to find a place for her. The novelty of her return had worn off. The shock value of seeing Sable back in a WWE ring had dissipated, replaced by the mundane reality of weekly television booking. She was placed in a repetitive cycle of bikini contests and tag team matches with Tori Wilson. While these segments still drew ratings from the male demographic, they lacked the narrative heat of her 1998 run. There was no Stone Cold Steve Austin to play off of. There was no genuine heat with Luna Vashon. It was content for the sake of content. Furthermore, the locker room culture had shifted. The women's division was becoming more athletic. Performers like Lita, Victoria, and Molly Holly were pushing for longer matches and more serious storylines. Sable, with her reliance on sexuality and limited in-ring skill set, represented the old guard that many of the new wrestlers wanted to move past. The friction wasn't explosive like it was in 1999. It was a low-grade, constant erosion of enthusiasm. Rena was punching the clock. The turning point for her entire existence and the catalyst for her eventual erasure occurred in March 2004 at Wrestlemania 20 in Madison Square Garden. This event is infamous in wrestling history, but usually for the match between Brock Lesnar and Goldberg. It was an open secret that both men were leaving the company immediately after the match, Goldberg to retirement and Lesnar to the NFL. The New York crowd, smart and ruthless, hijacked the match, booing both men out of the building. It was a surreal, hostile environment. Rena was there, watching from the monitors. She was in a tag team match that night, pairing with Tori Wilson against Stacy Keibler and Miss Jackie. It was an evening gown match. While the men were allowed to have their exits on their own terms, the women were still being asked to strip down to their underwear for applause. The juxtaposition must have been jarring. Rena was watching the man she loved, Brock Lesnar, effectively tell the WWE to shove it. Brock was walking away from a multi-million-dollar contract because he valued his sanity over the fame. He hated the travel. He hated the politics. He hated being owned. Witnessing Brock's rebellion triggered something in Rena. She had tried to rebel in 1999 with a lawsuit, and while she got a settlement, she lost her career. Brock was doing it differently. He was just leaving. In the weeks following WrestleMania 20, Brock Lesnar began his short-lived attempt to join the Minnesota Vikings. He was gone from the WWE. Rena, however, was still under contract. She was still on the road. This created a volatile dynamic. The power couple was separated. Brock was in Minnesota, training for football, living the quiet life he craved. Rena was stuck in the loop. Airports, rental cars, arenas. The disparity in their lifestyles began to create tension. Brock wanted her home. Rena likely wanted to be home, but a contract is a contract. The summer of 2004 was the death rattle of the Sable character. The WWE, perhaps sensing her foot was out the door, booked her into a feud with Tori Wilson. It was a student versus teacher storyline. The blow-off match took place at the Great American Bash in June 2004. It is a match that is almost never referenced in WWE history books. It wasn't a classic. It was a strange, disjointed affair where Sable, the dominant heel, was defeated by Tori Wilson. The finish of the match was symbolic. Sable, the woman who had once powerbombed champions and held the world in her palm, was pinned by the next generation sex symbol. It was the industry telling her, "We are done with you." Her final appearance occurred on the SmackDown following the pay-per-view. She appeared in a segment, looked at the camera, and that was it. There was no retirement speech. There was no "Thank you, Sable" chant. She just evaporated. On August 10th, 2004, WWE announced that Rena Mero and the company had mutually agreed to part ways. The statement was brief, corporate, and cold. It cited her desire to spend more time with her family. For once, the corporate press release was telling the truth. The story, however, does not end with her leaving. In fact, the most intense chapter of her conflict with the industry was just beginning. But this time, she was fighting a proxy war. When Brock Lesnar left WWE in 2004, He had signed a non-compete clause that was incredibly restrictive. It essentially forbade him from working in any combat sports or entertainment capacity anywhere in the world until 2010. It was a draconian attempt by WWE to prevent their creation from making money elsewhere. When Brock failed to make the final roster of the Minnesota Vikings, he wanted to return to wrestling, but not to WWE. He wanted to work in Japan. WWE sued him. This legal battle, which raged from 2005 to 2006, dragged Rina back into the fray. The WWE legal team knew that to get to Brock, they could pressure his support system. Rina was the weak point. She was the one who knew the inner workings of the business. She was the one advising him. During this period, the relationship between Brock and Rina was reportedly volatile. They were two alpha personalities under immense pressure. They had a new baby on the way, a massive lawsuit hanging over their heads, and an uncertain financial future. They broke up. They got back together. They got engaged. They called it off. It was a chaotic, passionate, messy time, but it forged a bond that was unbreakable. They realized that it was them against the world, specifically them against the WWE machine. In 2006, a judge ruled in favor of Brock Lesnar, striking down the non-compete clause as overly broad and unenforceable. It was a massive victory. It meant Brock was free, and if Brock was free, Rina was free. On May 6, 2006, Rina Greek and Brock Lesnar were married. The wedding was not a televised event. There were no cameras from Entertainment Tonight. There were no photos sold to People magazine. It was a private ceremony. This wedding marked the definitive death of Sable. By taking the name Rina Lesnar, she was shedding the skin of the character that had brought her so much fame and so much pain. The couple made a decision that would define the next 2 decades of their lives. They decided to move to Merrifield, Saskatchewan. To understand the magnitude of this decision, you have to look at a map. Merrifield is a village. The population is less than 400 people. It is located in the rural Canadian prairies, miles from the nearest city. It is a place of brutal winters and absolute isolation. For a woman who had spent the last decade in Miami, New York, and Los Angeles, moving to a farm in Saskatchewan was not just a relocation, it was a transformation. It was a rejection of the modern world. They bought a massive plot of land. They built a gate, and they locked it. While Rina disappeared from the public eye, she did not stop working. She simply shifted roles. She became the invisible manager of Brand Lesnar. When Brock decided to transition into mixed martial arts, the skepticism was high. He was viewed as a fake wrestler trying to fight for real. Rina was instrumental in this transition. She was the gatekeeper. She managed the logistics of his training camps. She insulated him from the media. In June 2007, the professional wrestling industry faced its reckoning. The Chris Benoit tragedy didn't just dominate headlines, it shattered the illusion of the business, exposing the rot of drug abuse, concussions, and the grinding pressure of the road. For Rina Lesnar, sitting in the quiet isolation of the Canadian prairies, this horror must have felt like a validation. She had known the darkness of that locker room. Her decision to walk away in 2004 and Brock's decision to follow her suddenly looked less like a career change and more like a survival strategy. They had jumped off the train before it derailed. But anonymity is expensive. To maintain their fortress, they needed capital, and the only commodity they had to sell was violence. When Brock Lesnar announced his transition to the UFC, the wrestling world scoffed, calling it a publicity stunt. But for Rina, it marked a terrifying new chapter. It is one thing to watch your husband perform in a scripted match. It is an entirely different psychological burden to watch him enter a locked cage with a man trained to inflict unconsciousness. During Brock's meteoric run, from his debut in 2008 to capturing the heavyweight championship, Rena was a constant, albeit ghostly, presence. The cameras would find her at cageside, but the Sable of 1998 was gone. In her place was a woman with minimal makeup, hands clutched together, watching with a mixture of pride and dread. She became the anti-wag, refusing reality shows and interviews, treating fame as a hazardous material to be contained. She was the emotional anchor of the Death Clutch team, the silence in Brock's storm. However, the true test of their partnership came in late 2009. During a hunting trip in Canada, Brock fell gravely ill with diverticulitis. It was a life-threatening situation. A hole had burned through his colon, and his body was poisoning itself. In a remote hospital in Manitoba, with Brock delirious on morphine and fading fast, it was Rena who fought the doctors. It was Rena who arranged the emergency evacuation by private plane to a top-tier facility in the United States. For weeks, the strongest man on the planet lay in a hospital bed, looking like a skeleton. This is the part of the story the cameras never saw. The woman once dismissed by fans as a gold digger was the only thing standing between her husband and death. This trauma galvanized their bond. It solidified a pact. The world gets Brock Lesnar, the fighter, but they do not get the family. By 2012, due to the lasting effects of his illness, Brock's fighting career was winding down. The WWE was waiting. Vince McMahon, desperate for star power, offered a deal that defied all industry norms: millions of dollars for limited dates, no house shows, and total autonomy. But this deal came with an unspoken yet crucial clause regarding his wife. Rena was not to be mentioned. Historically, when a wrestling couple returns, the company wants the package deal. They want the storyline. But when Brock walked back onto Monday Night Raw in April 2012, he walked alone. Rena had no interest in returning. She knew that Sable was a creature of the male gaze, a character built on validation she no longer needed. This created a strange paradox. She was the reason Brock was able to return. Her support allowed him to function. Yet, she had to be invisible in the product. This is where the Erasure moved from a passive act to an active corporate policy. It is not a hostile erasure like that of Chris Benoit. It is a soft erasure, an erasure of omission. When WWE celebrates the history of the women's evolution, they point to Trish Stratus or Lita. Yet statistically, Sable was a bigger draw than all of them. Her merchandise numbers in the 90s were astronomical. But to acknowledge Sable is to acknowledge Rena Lesnar. And to acknowledge Rena Lesnar is to invite questions that Brock does not want asked. So the company acquiesces. They bury the memory of their biggest female star to keep their biggest male star happy. It is the ultimate irony. The woman who once sued the company for harassment is now respected enough that they obey her wish to be forgotten. Today, the woman who once defined an era of noise lives in absolute triumph. In Merrifield, Saskatchewan, amidst the endless snow, Rena Lesnar has constructed a life that is the complete antithesis of Sable. She has no social media. She grants no interviews. She raises her sons, Turk and Duke, in a deliberate vacuum, shielding them entirely from the radioactive gaze of the public eye. While the industry she left behind continues to churn, and while the old regimes crumble, she simply watches from a distance. She has declined the Hall of Fame, refused the reunion shows, and rejected the nostalgia. She understands that to step back into the light is to invite the chaos back in. In the end, her greatest victory wasn't a championship belt or a Playboy cover. It was the realization that the only way to truly win the game of fame is to stop playing it. She didn't vanish because she lost. She vanished because she was finished. The show was over, and the Queen finally got to go home.